Welcome to Why Knowledge Matters. Welcome. In this episode, Karen Gazith joins me to discuss her book, Teaching with Purpose: How to Tactfully Implement Evidence-Based Practices in Your Classroom. Welcome, Karen. I'm very pleased to have you back on the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Really nice. So I'm very excited to actually talk about your book because you have so much to say, and I know you very well as my former teacher. So I'm extremely pleased to have you back. Now, let's start with what made you write this book in the first place?
So I think the book is an accumulation of my years of working with teachers, being in classrooms, interacting with students, and all of the evidence that exists, especially over the past, I want to say, maybe 10 years, that has looked at evidence-based practice. So I think it's seeing what's going on in classrooms and knowing about all of the research that exists in effective teaching practices and really wanting to bring to the classroom teacher, to the school systems, to governments, hopefully as well, these evidence-based practices that if they're implemented in the classroom, students do better.
And what's really important, and I really want to touch on this, first and foremost, for you see teaching not simply as an art, but also as a science. In other words, if you implement certain strategies that you elaborate in the book, you are much more likely to make a huge impact on students.
Absolutely. And that's particularly because of researchers, individuals, and I've read a lot of research specifically from individuals like Marzano and Hattie and others. There have been others that have really influenced my thinking. But the meta-analyses that have been conducted, where it's not only looking at one research study, but it's a meta-analysis of lots and lots and lots of research studies that are all pointing to, with using good statistical, really solid statistical analyses like effect size, that point to when teachers use these practices, students do better. And compelling research indicating that when teachers use these practices. So the reason why I speak about the art and the science of teaching is because teachers will always bring, it's a social act. We're constantly engaging with students and with colleagues. So each teacher has to bring themselves into the classroom and their own characters, their own dynamic characteristics that they bring into the classroom. But at the same time, there really is a science to teaching. And we talk about science, there's evidence, there's research. Lots of good research, again, as I said, about the meta-analyses that have been conducted. Good research indicating that these practices help students learn. As I often tell teachers in my, when I do workshops and in my university classrooms, when teachers use these specific practices, students do better, as we see from the research. The other thing that I often tell teachers that I work with is there are lots of factors that influence student learning that take place outside of the school environment, and we don't have a lot of control over those factors. We know that when families are involved in student schooling, they do better. But we have limited control about what goes on outside before the student walks into the classroom. We do have some control, and there are ways to engage families, but the factors that exist within the school, the moment the child walks into the school and goes into their classroom, the most valuable element that relates to effective student learning, engagement, and their belief that they belong in school is how well teachers teach. And the teacher factor is so absolutely critical. We used to look at it in terms, I've been, involved in education for a number of decades, and we used to look at it so much, in terms of student factors. So we used to look at, when students behave in this way, or when students have this particular learning style, they learn. And, we realized over the past couple of years that it is in fact the myth of learning styles. There isn't really good research that says that this characteristic learns better in this way. And what the research, and again, the meta-analyses are showing over the past, decade, and so, is that it's so much about the teacher variable. How effectively teachers teach will influence how well students learn.
And one thing you mentioned, just the effect size, how important it is to actually see if an intervention or a strategy actually works better for student and not. And obviously there you have also the complexity of the variables, as you just said. Well, you have the teachers, right, which can be very different in a different classroom, and therefore you might not really know, well, is it the teacher or is it actually the strategy that works better? But nonetheless, due to your meta-analysis from the researchers that you draw on, you can actually pin down some variables that are really key. And one thing I find very difficult too is, obviously, as you just mentioned, a classroom is not a controlled environment. Okay, it's not a lab in this sense, and so it's extremely hard to actually gain any insight of an intervention that you actually do. Obviously, there is the ethical aspect. Okay, you can't just say, well, with these a few students, I will try out these evidence-based practices, and with the other ones, I can't. You can't really do that. So it's so hard. Can you a little bit elaborate a little bit more on that and how important, this effect size is, and how you actually, decipher it, because it really seems to me it's impossible unless you do it, as you just said, with a meta-analysis.
Right. So the point about research is, if you're going to implement an intervention that is effective, you don't want to do it with one group of students and not the other group. And of course, there are teacher variables as well. The value is you have to implement the intervention, but the timing of it could be different. So you start with one group of students, you see the impact, and then you can compare that group of students to the others, and then the second group of students will receive the intervention as well. So there's a timed element there as well, where you are able to see the difference. When you look at effect size, the interesting thing about it is that you're looking at growth over a time period. So how much change has there been in a student from the pre-implementation of the strategy to post-implementation of the strategy. So you're looking at student growth, and you're looking at the specific strategies for this one group of students that led to that group in comparison to a second group of students. But the value of these meta-analyses is that we're not looking at only one, and that again, I think we have to be thankful to the researchers that I mentioned, in addition to others who have been involved in these meta-analyses, is that we're not looking at one research study and saying, when you implement learning goals, students do better. It's not based solely on one study. It's really an accumulation of, or an examination of, many research studies that have been conducted. And when you examine all of these research studies, the evidence points to the effectiveness of articulating learning goals. You also interview students. So students have enormous agency. They're the actors in their own learning. And it's so interesting. I can tell you informally from the interactions that I've had with students, and certainly the research points to this as well. You interview the student, and the student says, it's much clearer to me now. And you say to the student, well, why is that? And the student will tell you it's because the teacher started the lesson by saying, this is what I want you to know, and this is what I hope you'll be able to do by the end. So you also listen to the student voice And the student is telling you when, and telling me also when I interact and ask questions, the student will tell you, when the teacher does these things, it's easier for me to understand, to follow, and to engage in the learning.
So one thing, when you look at student growth, there's also this problem that, some students, they might start, let's say they take some, additional courses during the break in summer, they come with a very solid knowledge base, and therefore their growth is much less than someone who might come in and you do your initial assessment for them. So there's also there obviously a challenge. Can you just elaborate maybe a little bit on that?
Sure. So John Hattie is known for his list of the important variables that impact student learning. And his list is growing, and he started with something like 154. The last time I looked, I think there were 192 variables, perhaps even more than that. And if you look at those variables, almost all of them are effective. The question is, to what level of effectiveness? So you want to look at the strategies that have an effect size. Usually you look at an effect size of anywhere from 0.4 to 0.5 statistically. But there are very few strategies in his list that many of them have a very limited effect size, so not great impact on student learning, but there are very few strategies that actually have a negative impact on student learning. And one of those is the summer break. So we know that students spend maybe 2.5 months, depending on where you live, away from school. That has a negative impact on student learning for most students, again, depending on what they did over the summer, but we're always most worried about the vulnerable students who had difficulty at the end of the year. Then they spent a summer not engaged in formal learning, and then they come back at the beginning of the year. And I think, again, important for teachers to know that the critical nature of those first few months, and how important it is to bring students back into the learning environment after not having been there for a while. I think we have to look at ourselves as adults. If we learn something, I can tell you, many of us, will say, I saw a movie a week ago, I don't remember what the movie was about. We learn different things and we have to remind ourselves. And sometimes we don't think about that and the impact of that on our students. So we may be in a science course with them on Wednesday, we see them again the following Wednesday, or we see them at the end of the summer. We have to recognize that if we don't make connections between what we taught in the past and what they're learning today, we have to bring them back in, remind them, lots and lots of repetition, so that they are able to move back into the learning and connect it to what they learned before the summer, or even, yesterday or last week. One of my favorite comments that I make all the time is that teachers need to slow down. And I think if teachers slow down their teaching, just slow it all down, I think we'll teach a lot more effectively. And I think we'll go quicker because we won't need to constantly be going backwards because we moved along too quickly and students fell off the track at some point. So we had to go backwards.
I want to just elaborate now, not elaborate, but discuss your first chapter on conceptualizing the classroom as an ecosystem and how important the teacher is in the whole equation. And I would just give you some example that you mentioned. It's really to instilling the belief in students that they can succeed. In other words, we have to feel and we have to show them that we believe in their success when it comes to learning.
Yeah. So, you mentioned, I think, the most important point, and that is students tend to see themselves in the teacher. You see yourself in the eyes of the teacher. And if the teacher has faith in you and believes in your success, chances are you're going to believe in your success. If a teacher says to you, you're going to do well, now let's figure out how. That's a really important message to the student. This teacher believes in me. This teacher is not going to let me fail. I better get to work. So how the teacher perceives your success is critical. The importance of the chapter on ecosystem is that the classroom is really, it is a mini society. And we first and foremost have to think about these students in my class are going to be the society of tomorrow. What kind of society am I aspiring to create amongst these young people? So do I want a society where everybody has a place, everybody belongs, students are not walking into this place thinking some people belong more than others? I often quote Paulo Freire's The Have and the Have-Nots. Is this a classroom? And he wrote his wonderful book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Is this an environment where you walk in and some students feel, I don't belong here. I'm one of those have-nots. That's not the kind of society we want in the future. And certainly we need to model that in our own classrooms. So the most important thing is when students walk in at the beginning of the year, every single day, every single class, is there that sense of, this is a place where I belong. There's a role for me. Sometimes I need help, sometimes I give support to others, but everybody has a valuable role in this society. And in order for that to happen, of course, the variables are, I have to feel safe. So, I have to believe that I'm not going to be made fun of. If this teacher asks me a question and I can't answer the question, she's going to guide me and support me, and it's going to be a lesson to everybody else. Take the time. There's nothing wrong with students waiting a couple of minutes while the teacher engages with that one student who may be struggling with something. That's a great lesson to others. You need to sometimes wait, just wait, still your body while the teacher is providing support. We're not talking about 10 minutes, talking about a couple of minutes, but sometimes that needs to happen. So you're really role modeling for the students, and you're showing everybody what it feels like and what it looks like to feel safe, and that everybody is appreciated, that the teacher believes in growth mindset, which means that you're constantly learning. You may not know something now, you don't know how to add fractions with like denominators, but you are going to learn. And we would say the same thing with everything you're learning in school, right? Growth mindset rather than fixed mindset. Through good learning, good engagement with others, students are constantly growing and developing. And the teacher is the ultimate role model in the creation of this classroom. The other thing that I mentioned about the ecosystem is the physical classroom. So the physical classroom is also critical to creating this ecosystem. So the ecosystem is everybody belongs, I give, I take, and everybody's role is critical within the society. The physical placement of that classroom as a mini society is important as well. So there needs to be space. We don't think about these things. The teacher has to be able to walk around, engage with students. So desks clustered together is not a great thing, because then I can't engage with individual students. Where students sit is important. The students that I need to engage maybe a little bit more closely with, I have to make sure that I have quick access to those students. In the book, I talk about with-itness. With-itness really is eyes in the back of your head. And with-itness is just a critical feature of that effective classroom, that I'm aware of everything that's going on. Even if I'm engaging with one student, I see what's going on in the corner. I'll get to you in a minute. I'll be right over while students are engaged in their work. So, it's proximity, it's with-itness. There are lots of factors that play into creating this mini society, where everybody feels like, I want to be there. There's a place for me.
And you mentioned actually in a last period, how you can actually do this and to really lift up students, even though they might not know, but you can just approach it with a different question, or to use scaffold, and you just ask, and so then the students goes away with the question, can get away maybe with it, but at least he contributed some steps to answering the question. Now I just want to ask you on valuing every learner, and there also obviously there's always this pyramid. Okay, it's about like grades, but what you also mentioned is that we should value all the contribution of all the students, whether they are academically strong or weak. Can you elaborate a little bit how you can actually do it, because you give really concrete steps how to make this happen, even though you might think that it's not possible because I can be everywhere in the classroom, right, as a teacher.
Right. So, I mean, I think there are so many strategies that I write about in the book, and I could just touch on a couple of them now. We talk a lot about differentiation, and I think teachers, their eyes glaze over, I think, when they hear the word differentiation, because I think it's been overused and misunderstood. So, it's important for me, certainly, that when we talk about differentiation, if we bring it up, it has to be something that will actually resonate with teachers. And what teachers say so often is, we have to recognize that they're going into a classroom, in 5 minutes, in 10 minutes, or the next day. So whatever discussion that we have with teachers, it has to make their life better and easier when they engage with students in the classroom. So differentiation has to ultimately be practical and a tactical tool that can be used. The way that I explain differentiation in terms of meeting diverse needs is, first and foremost, it starts as a value. So differentiation is a value, and I often say it's like kindness. If we believe in kindness as a value, it's something we're doing all the time. So we don't say, I think I'm going to be kind when I talk to Yannick, but I don't need to be kind when I speak to someone else. We wouldn't do that. It's a value. We do it all the time. So differentiation is very similar. Differentiation is a value, and the value of differentiation is students deserve to have their needs met. It's a student's, you could say it's their Bill of Rights, it's their human rights. Students have to be in school, and they deserve to believe that they deserve to have those needs met when they're in school. That's their right. They deserve to thrive. They deserve to grow. They deserve to leave the school feeling better than when they got to school in the morning. They deserve to know more at the end of the day, understand more, be able to do more, even if it's slight, at the end of the day. So, differentiation is that belief that students deserve to have their needs met. Then we have to operationalize it, because if it remains a theory, there isn't really much we can do with it. So how do we operationalize differentiation? In the chapter, I speak about differentiation and universal design, and those two things are very similar. Universal design, and they both bring to this tactical element of differentiation. So I'll start with universal design. Universal design speaks to one element of it is, what are the barriers and how do I break down those barriers? What are the things that we need to think about when we're planning our lessons and our units? We need to think about what the barriers are for certain students. A barrier should not be an internal fact. We shouldn't speak to barriers like, a learning disability, attention deficit disorder, autism spectrum. Those may be disorders and things that are internalized within or internal elements of individuals. But when we talk about barriers, we have to think of these barriers in terms of things that can be removed, obstacles that we can remove. So when we're planning our lesson, we need to think about who the students are. And then we need to ask ourselves if there are specific barriers that would prevent the students from learning, because it's their right to be able to learn and grow. So if I'm going to be asking the students to read a portion of the text. A barrier might be the text is too difficult. Once I state the barrier in that way, I know I can give students a simpler text, or I can have them pair and read the text with one another. If the barrier is I'm asking the students to sit and work for 25 minutes by themselves, the amount of time they need to sit is too challenging. Maybe I can break that into 5-minute blocks, and I can scaffold by giving them a sheet that guides them with maybe some prompting questions. So I need to think about what the barriers are and how I can provide access for students who have those barriers. That's one example.
Now, also in chapter 1, you actually mentioned, and you draw on Sizer and Sizer's research, that students are constantly watching, and this also has huge implication for teachers, because that's why part of it, why it is so demanding, is that it really requests us to be role models, in any single second, which is extremely demanding. Can you a little bit elaborate on what you mean by this and the implication it has for the teacher and for students' success?
So Sizer and Sizer's book is about the students who are always watching. And I think we have to recognize that they watch everything we do far more than, them hearing what we say. They're always observing what we do. So we have to make sure that our interactions with them and our interactions with even our colleagues act as role models. So if we say to students, you need to include everybody, don't leave anyone out, but then we ask students to choose their own groups in class, and you have that 1 or 2 students that are standing there saying, I have no one to work with, we're not modeling what we're saying. If we're not being inclusive with our colleagues, but we're asking students to be inclusive with one another, we're not acting as role models. If a student asks a question and we think it's a silly question and we roll our eyes, again, it's not lost on the students. They see that. They see everything that we do. So we need to really be role models to how we want our students to interact with one another. I just one thing that's important, one thing that I've noted with that is when teachers, which is only natural and it certainly happens, but there are students who wear on our patients, and for that student who can't find that book, let's say, or their desk is really messy, or there's papers around their desk, and the teacher sort of says in a frustrated voice, you need to clean up, or you need to stop doing that. What I've noticed is when that student leaves and goes into, when the students leave and they go to recess, you often hear the other students mimicking the teacher's words. So you see that they engage with that student with the same type of frustration. Come on, don't you know what the rules are? So it's just so important that we are always role modeling for our students.
In your chapter 2, it's really about communicating learning goals and how important it is. It's as simple as that. It's really also about motivation. Obviously, if you have a goal, then we have something that we can aspire to and therefore work accordingly. Can you elaborate how this ought to unfold in a classroom as a teacher?
Sure. So the chapter on learning goals, like you said, in that chapter, I address the importance of beginning in the planning stage. You have to know what it is you want students to know, understand, and be able to do by the end of the unit, and more specifically, by the end of each lesson. If you don't think about those terms in the planning, then you can't reach goals if you don't know that those goals exist. So in your planning, you need to think very clearly about what students will know by the end, what the big concepts are, and what it is you want them to be able to do by the end of the lesson. Then when you go into the class, you need to communicate those goals to the students, because how could we expect students to reach a goal if they don't know what that goal is? So we begin the lesson in really simple terms, especially for young students, by asking them, by telling them rather what it is we want them to know. So what are the critical facts, like dates and names and terminology and definition of important terms, what those big concepts are, so why it is we're teaching what we're teaching, what those overriding important concepts are, and what students will actually do by the end of the lesson to show us evidence that they have mastered those learning goals. So we need to think about learning goals in the planning stage, and we need to articulate, clearly communicate those goals to students. And then in the chapter of formative assessment, I talk about the different ways to check if students have mastered the goals.
Can you just elaborate on these informal assessment and how important they are for teachers, and really as a mechanism in order to make sure that I do the right thing, or in other words, that my teaching methods are effective. In other words, that to ensure that students actually learn what I'm telling them to learn.
Sure. So, I often talk about a lesson almost like a frame. It starts with articulation of learning goals for the students. So we say to students, these are the goals. This is what I hope you will know, understand, and be able to do by the end. And then, we engage in effective teaching practices. I write a lot about that in the book. And then at the end of the lesson, we have to assess whether or not students have mastered those learning goals. So it's often that frame. I articulate them, I teach effectively, which doesn't mean that I'm always talking, but there's a transmission of learning to the students in multiple ways. And then at the end, I check using formative assessment. So, there are simple examples, like if I wanted them to know how to calculate or be able to calculate a certain problem, then at the end, I give them an example. I ask them to do it independently, just one example, and I need to see if they have in fact mastered what I was hoping that they would master by the end of that lesson. So that's one example. If I was teaching them how to write a topic sentence at the end, I need to see whether or not they can write a topic sentence. If I wanted them to explain a certain term, I need to see whether or not they can explain that term. There are many different things that we can do. One good way of evaluating, I mentioned a couple. So think of what you wanted them to be able to do and then ask them to do that at the end. Another way to evaluate formatively at the end of the lesson is something called 3-2-1. So the three most important points that you learned in this lesson, 2 questions that you have in terms of what remains unclear, and one way that you can immediately implement what you've just learned. So that's one example. Another example that I use often is a note to an absent student. So there is somebody who is not in class today. Share with them, you can give a number, the 3 most important things we learned in this class. Remember, you're sharing it for an absent student. So you need to be really clear about the important facets that we learned. There's also something called a response card, so we can use it using technology. There's Plickr and other apps that can be used where you ask the question. So what is a prime number, or what is the definition of mitosis, or a specific question, and every student would respond on, either using Plickr or any of these other apps, or we can go old-fashioned and ask them to just hold up, the response. What is your definition of, or what are the 3 ways in which we can recycle? And then the teacher at the end of the class can very quickly look to see if the students are mastering the new learning. Of course, there's always, what is your belief about? So there isn't always a correct answer. What do you think about? What is your best definition of? So we can also get student thinking as well. One other example that I like to do is I use different shapes. I show them a circle. What is circling around in your head right now? I show them a square. What is squaring with what you already knew about this? I show them a triangle. What are the 3 most important points? And I show them this squiggly shape. What is not sitting right with you? So what's confusing you, what's troubling you. So when we do those different kinds of formative assessments, we get a lot of information about where students are in the learning process.
So let's go quickly a little bit back to chapter 3 and incorporating strategic teaching and learning. And one point you make, I think it's really important, because there's this assumption that, well, first and foremost, students should draw on their own knowledge base, but you are very clear and you say that, well, certain knowledge that might be appropriate in an ELA class. However, for certain knowledge, especially when it comes to quantitative knowledge, such as science and really facts, it's not a very good strategy, because then these false facts are out there in the open. Can you elaborate what you mean by that?
So, I think there's also a misunderstanding about the concept of prior knowledge. So, I've seen teachers begin a lesson where or a unit where they're starting, not new, it's never new. Students always come with some knowledge, but the concepts have not yet been presented. And I've seen teachers start by saying, what is your definition of, mitosis, free trade, whatever the concept is, and students share a lot of misinformation. When you share that misinformation, what ends up happening is it becomes part of your mental representation of the concept along with what the teacher will tell you. So you have this fusing of a lot of incorrect facts with the correct facts, but the brain doesn't go, okay, get rid of this. Only it really fuses the incorrect information with the correct information. So what teachers often say is, but I want to bring in their prior knowledge. Prior knowledge means you know what this thing is. You've learned it and you know it, and I want you to remember what it is. Prior knowledge doesn't refer to it's a new concept, so I'm going to ask students to guess. The guessing is not good. Very different from saying, from doing a pre-assessment, where you ask each individual student to say, what do you think, mitosis means, or what is the denominator, or whatever it is that you're asking them. So therefore, when you start, and I talk about that in, as you said, I think in chapter 3, the first part of the learning process is what we call new knowledge. It's relatively new. Again, students are not coming tabula rasa. They do have some knowledge. I give the example of a grade 1 class with a teacher coming in, starting a unit on whales and saying to students, hey, what do you think a whale is? And students are going, it's a big fish and they're dangerous and scary and stay away from them if you see. Now, then the teacher will say, thank you, everyone. Of course, you're not going to say to a grade 1 child, you're wrong. It's actually not. So I think that the teacher needs to start with, you could say to students, have you ever seen a whale? I mean, that's fine. But when it comes to what a whale is, it's the first part of learning, which is new knowledge. And when knowledge is new, it really needs to come from a reliable source. So the first stage of the learning process is when you're sharing new knowledge with students. And that knowledge, again, a reliable source doesn't mean it comes only from the teacher. It could come from, there could be a great YouTube clip that you want to show them. It could come from a video. It can come from a textbook. It could come from the teacher, but the information has to be reliable. They can do their own Google search as long as we know that the searches are reliable sources. So the first stage in the process is that new information that has to come from a reliable source. You want me to talk about the other two?
Well, you know what? If you feel like, just go ahead. Sure.
Okay. So that's the first stage in the learning process. Once they have the knowledge that they need to engage and begin doing something with that knowledge, we talk about that as consolidation. So now they're learning the skill. And as they learn the skill, it requires a lot of good practice and role modeling, explicit teaching. So that explicit teaching usually follows the format of, as the teacher, you model, I do, then we do together as a full class, then students work on something, they work on that specific skill individually while I walk around and see how they're doing. And then once I see that they've mastered the skill, then I want lots and lots of practice, which we call consolidation. So we need to give practice. Students at this stage should be working by themselves. It's problematic at this beginning stage of skill development when students work in pairs, because you want to make sure that each student individually is mastering the skill. The third stage in the learning process is they're moving towards expertise. So they have the knowledge, they're developing the skill, they're mastering the skill. This is at this third stage when they're becoming experts, where you want them to come together in groups and work together collaboratively.
In your chapter 4, improving classroom management. And I liked your approach because you really draw also on, behaviorist theory in my view. And to you, any behavior, especially so-called misbehavior or inappropriate behavior, in your view, is really a way for the students to communicate a message or to ask in one way or another for help. Can you further elaborate how
Sure.
you elaborated here in the book?
Sure. So, the chapter on classroom management, I think the first thing that's most critical, and I think we've heard it so many times, but it deserves being stated all the time because of its importance, is the most important facet is the relationship between the teacher and the student. I use the quote, students don't really care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that concept of really caring, the student has to know that there's the teacher cares about them as individuals. So that relationship that you build with the students is essential. The other thing that I speak about in the chapter is behavior as a form of communication. So when students misbehave, I think if we understand it rather than misbehavior, which it is, it's very disturbing and difficult, and it makes it difficult for teachers to teach. But I think if we reframe it as a form of communication, we'll be more apt to deal with it effectively. So when students misbehave, they're telling us something. So we have to try and figure out what it is that they're telling us. Students are telling us that they want something or they're trying to avoid something. And if we understand it within that context, then we can try and figure out what they need to tell us so that they don't need to misbehave in order to get what it is that they need.
You also say that punishment is not a really appropriate solution to it. Of course, there are limits, and sometimes as teachers have to do it because they have to set these limits. However, you say that it actually just is an invitation to do, these kinds of negative behavior in a more sophisticated way. And we actually have plenty of evidence that this is the case, especially when it comes to bullying prevention, for example. There is always these huge interventions, but it doesn't really change because it just gets so much more sophisticated, especially also the older students grow. Can you elaborate a little bit on this further?
Yeah, it goes underground, unfortunately, which makes it a lot more difficult to identify and address. So here there's a wonderful book by Mackenzie called Setting Limits. And in this book, he speaks about most students in the class are going to do what they're told. You ask them to stop speaking, they're going to stop. And then you have a small group of students who are going to see what the market will bear. They're going to sit back and they're going to see how the teacher interacts. Does the teacher actually do what they say they're going to do? So they just sort of wait and see. And then you have a small group of students who I think all teachers know display challenging behaviors. The problem is that punishment in a classroom is very detrimental to the majority of students. it tends to be loud and disturbing and, quite frankly, scary for many students. And for the students who are the most challenging, punishment, as Mackenzie speaks about it, is like a red flag in front of a bull. When you say to somebody who presents with challenging behavior, if you do this, you're going to get punished, it for them is almost like an invitation, I dare you, and it becomes extremely ineffective. The other challenge with punishment is you're saying to a student who's learning and growing and developing, you're saying, if you do this, you're going to get punished, but there's no educational component to it. We need to explain, not all the time, not every day, but we have to make sure that it's understood that this behavior is maladaptive because. So the punishment leaves the most important educational component. They're kids, they're learning, they're growing, they're developing. And the last piece to it is there should be a consequence, but the consequence, again, we need to give students warning, not too many. But very often we give lots and lots of warnings, and we end up doing this cha-cha dance with students where they say something, we answer back, they answer back. That's really ineffective. So we need to be clear and educational and let students know what the consequences will be if the behavior continues, but the consequences need to be educational. And it's not, it could be difficult. It doesn't have to be difficult to think of educational consequences because they tend to be logical. So if you're not working well with another student, you're not going to get punished. There's a consequence, and the consequence is you won't be able to work with that student. You'll need to work alone. It's not a punishment. It's a logical consequence to your behavior. If you're misusing property, you won't be able to use that property. If you're not engaging in your work, if you're not doing your work, you're going to have to make up the time at some later point because you're losing good work time. So we're going to have to find another time that's a logical consequence. And if we engage in these logical consequences on a very consistent basis, because consistency is very often where things fall apart. If we are consistent, you lose good class time because you're not working, we'll make up the 5 minutes. When to make it up is up to each individual school. You won't have to do it for the year. The student will understand that this is a logical consequence to your behavior. And it tends to be a lot more educational than you're going to get a punishment. Even if the consequence would be the same as what you would give as a punishment, you're framing it in an educational way.
And I think one usually also that's missing that you just mentioned is consistency, okay, by the teacher, but also, and I think there is also there's huge potential still for every single teacher is using positive reinforcement and really always look at your readiness, as you just mentioned, for this occasion where you can actually lift up students to reinforce certain behavior. What do you think where there is the potential? Because it seems to me that there's a lot that we can do, but again, obviously it requires incredible commitment and it is tough work, right?
So reinforcement is extremely interesting. And the concept of reinforcement is we do more of what we're reinforced for doing. So when students are reinforced for a behavior, any behavior, positive or negative, you're going to see an increase in that behavior. So if I call out and I'm constantly being told to stop calling out, you're going to see more of that behavior because I'm getting reinforced. I want attention. I'm getting attention. It's going to continue. So whatever we reinforce is going to continue or grow. Therefore, the question is, what are we reinforcing? And we have to make sure that we're reinforcing the behaviors that we want to see more of and trying to ignore, unless the behaviors are dangerous or really hurtful, trying to ignore those small disturbing behaviors, because if we ignore them, they will go away. And I'm not suggesting we ignore things that are really disturbing, but we have to start to ignore a little bit more. So we need to start reinforcing the behaviors that we want to see more of. This is where it gets tricky with students who have maladaptive behaviors, because they're known for being the kids who misbehave. And what we need to do is start to notice approximations towards adaptive behaviors. So anytime they start to move towards a behavior that could be the beginning of something that's more adaptive. We can't wait for great showings of adaptive behavior. We need to reinforce any small attempt that students use to start to behave adaptively and reinforce those behaviors. So what we reinforce, you'll see more of. There's a little caveat here though. If students have a history of misbehaving, they're almost known for being kids who misbehave. They almost wear it in some cases like a badge. And it's not that easy to transition from I'm known for misbehaving to now I'm going to be known for something else. So that transition has to be gentle and it has to be subtle. So we make the mistake when a student who has a history of misbehaving suddenly does something positive and we make a huge deal about it in the classroom. That's really problematic, because I was always known for being the behavior problem kid in the class. Suddenly you're making a huge deal about this thing that I did. Wait a second. If I'm no longer that misbehaving kid, but I'm not yet a kid who really behaves well, I'm in this space of nothingness, that's a scary place to be. So I think teachers have to pay attention to a gradual transition. So we reinforce approximations, but we have to not go overboard in terms of the way in which we reinforce those behaviors. It could be subtle, and it could be just going over to the student with a thumbs up, well done. So I think these are some of the things that we need to consider.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It almost seems like, it can lead to identity crisis, for this particular student. That's really interesting. Well, just to wrap up, I think, your book captured so many good things, and we can't go through all the chapters due to time, but I just want to, ask you one question, because that's what really brought your book forward, is how demanding teaching is and how much is required, and also how much we can actually learn, and in a way that is science-based, and that is really also up to teachers, to instill this belief and the success in students. So therefore, my question is, do you think, given how demanding the profession is, because there's this debate, for example, in Quebec, the teacher retention rate is very, very low, okay? We are talking about like more than 50% actually of teachers, or a little bit less maybe, they retire. Before retirement, might they leave the profession. And I think within the first 5 years, I think that's about like, retention rate is maybe about 50%, correct me if I'm wrong. So do you think that in many ways, we also underestimate how demanding the teaching profession is in terms of your emotional, your social, your mental well-being?
Yes, I think it would be fair to say that teaching is one of the most challenging professions. And I think we all can understand what makes it so challenging. We come every single day to a group of students, either young students or students moving into adolescence or students in adolescence or moving out of adolescence, each transition with its own challenges. And there's all of the, the academic diverse needs that are present and the social needs that are present, and the increasing demands on the classroom teacher, the challenges that we know surround attention of students and how challenging it is to capture and keep their attention. The world that students are living in, social media is certainly making teaching so much more difficult, both from an academic attentional facet, but also from a social milieu and how difficult and challenging that is for students who spend so much time on social media, not to mention what happens at night. I'll just put it in there. Students are spending lots and lots of time on social media or, playing games. They're doing it just before they go to sleep. They're dreaming about the game. They're not having restful sleeps. So yes, teaching is challenging, very challenging, and becoming even more challenging today. Of course, the challenges always existed, but there's certainly unique challenges today. So yes, teaching is extremely difficult. What I think teachers need so that they remain in the profession, I think they need a couple of things. I think the movement out of university and into the classroom, I think that the challenge of that is underestimated. So that whole concept of apprenticeship is extremely important. Researchers have spoken about it as cognitive apprenticeship for children, adults also as they transition out of university and into the classroom, there needs to be that concept of apprenticeship. So I learned about the concept. I did my field placement, as many teachers do, but now I have a job working in a school and they need to receive guidance and support from somebody in the school. And schools have different individuals who are there to provide that support. But that apprenticeship, as you transition into a school, is very, very key. Professional development is imperative. So schools need to think about their vision, their belief system about education, what's most important, and again, hopefully it's around evidence-based practices. And then there needs to be a lot of really effective professional development, not one-off, but providing teachers with how do you do formative assessment, guiding them, giving them practice, sending them off into the classroom with very specific tactics and examples, and then meeting with them again and sharing their experiences so that it's really an ongoing process. Teachers need support and guidance, and ultimately teachers have to feel good about their practices. So that whole area of teacher efficacy is key. I'm going to do this thing every single day. I have to feel good about myself as a teacher. And the last point is the area of classroom management, which is often touted by teachers as one of the reasons why they find teaching to be so difficult. I think we have to spend a lot more time helping teachers manage the class. So it really isn't about dealing with behavior issues. We don't want to have to get there. If we manage well, we're going to be doing a whole lot less of dealing with poor behavior. We will, but much less. So teachers need a lot more support around how to effectively, and there are specific tactics that teachers can use to effectively, manage their class. So we go back to the ecosystem. So students are engaging and thriving and behaving adaptively with the teacher, with one another, with the material, etc.
Karen, thank you so much for being on the show. It's always enlightening to listening to you, and I loved your book. I can highly recommend it to any professional, whether new to the profession or a senior.
Yeah. So the book, I know it's easily accessible through the publishing company, which is Solution Tree, or, Amazon if you're in Canada, amazon.ca or amazon.com in the States. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Karen Gazith.